will get to share a little bit of their experiences as we go along throughout the workshop. I want to say a few words about the importance of telling our stories and building our own archives. As some of you may know, and you certainly probably know now from my bio, I spent a good deal of time over the last 2 decades researching, reading, writing, and teaching about the famed Black intellectual, educator, author, and activist Anna Julia Cooper. If you live in Washington, D.C., you probably know of Cooper as one of the principals of Dunbar High School, an outspoken advocate of racial and gender equality. Or maybe you've walked by her house in LaDroit Park at the corner T and 2nd, or driven through the Anna Julia Cooper Circle at 3rd and T Northwest. Less well known, perhaps, is that in 1902, Anna Julia Cooper waged what she referred to as her courageous revolt against Jim Crow education in our nation's capital, a revolt for which she was removed from her post as principal and excommunicated to Lincoln, Missouri for 5 years. Or that in 1925, at the age of 66, she became the 4th Black woman to earn a PhD when she got her doctorate from the University of Paris at Sorbonne. Or that at age 72, she took on the presidency of Freeling Housing University, where she remained active well into her 90s. Cooper was, by all accounts, an extraordinary figure in African American history. And indeed, in 1980, the Anacostia Neighborhood Museum commissioned an exhibition to recognize and preserve Cooper's legacy. The exhibit featured Cooper's letters, essays, greeting cards, event programs, poems, scraps of paper, notes about the work she and her students were doing, newspaper clippings, certificates of achievement, birth, marriage, and death records, scrapbooks, and photographs, items that Cooper had preserved in her own personal archive over many years. Most of those items are now housed at the Moreland Spingarn Research Center. So after the exhibit at the Anacostia Neighborhood Museum in 1981, historian Louise Hutchinson, then director of research at Anacostia Museum, wrote a biography based on the exhibit that is still one of the most important works on Cooper to this day. My mentor at the University of Maryland, Mary Helen Washington, explains that when Hutchinson finished the book, she delivered the first copy of the biography to Cooper's grandniece, one of 5 children that Cooper had adopted, Regina Benson. Upon receiving the book, Benson began to cry, rocking back and forth, but not saying a word. When Hutchinson asked her why she was crying, Benson replied, "Because nobody ever told me that Sis Annie was important." Now, I believe that Benson knew that Cooper was important, but that it was this act of public and communal recognition that moved her to tears. I tell this story as we start out today because Cooper's individual protests against Jim Crow education as early as 1902, her years of service to Black communities in Washington, D.C., and her intellectual contributions that shape the very nature of our protests today may have gotten lost in the larger sweep of history were it not for Cooper constructing her own personal archive and the recognition of Cooper and others that her story was important and worth preserving. It illustrates the need to value our stories and the stories of those around us, while also recognizing how institutions like the Anacostia Community Museum and the Moreland Spingarn Research Center have been our stalwarts in preserving Black history. So it is really, truly a great honor to be here with all of you today as we stand at the precipice of a historic but not unprecedented moment and discover new ways to tell, preserve, and share our stories. I want to say a few quick reminders to our audience before we get started. You can share and comment and participate through the Q&A function, so please, you're welcome to do that. We'll also be monitoring our live stream on Facebook, so if you're joining us via Facebook, feel free to comment and post questions, and we'll do our best to address those during the Q&A. If you're following us on Twitter, you can follow us at ccp_or, or hashtag DigBlack. And finally, I've dropped into the chat a link to the 2020 census and to voter registration, and to a way in which you can mobilize now for the vote by adding links to voter registration and the census from your own websites. If you have an organization, CCP has done the work to make that easy, so you can do that. But in this historic moment, we can take a number of different actions, and one of those is to vote, vote, vote. So I'm going to turn it over to Denise Berger, but I just want to take one more moment to say a big thank you and a show of gratitude and appreciation to everyone whose labor has gone into this today. AARPDC, Center for Black Digital Research, Penn State's Office of Digital Pedagogy and Scholarship, the Colored Conventions Project, the Anacostia Community Museum, and the AKA. So thank you all very much, and I'm going to turn it over to my co-organizer, Denise Berger.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moody Turner. And thanks again to everyone who has joined us. I want to very briefly reiterate the central role that Lewis Davis and AARP-DC has played in conceptualizing and making this entire event possible, and also reiterate the importance and the support of the Sisters of the AKA would not be possible without your continued support. As Dr. Moody Turner said, we're standing right now at the crossroads, and she very graciously reminded us, and I'm going to put an emphasis on how important it is for us to not only recognize our own value as African Americans in this time and this place, but to remember that though the leaders of these organizations and movements get much of the credit in history, it's actually the foot soldiers who do the work. And so it is on us to ensure that we register to a vote. It's on us to ensure that we make sure that we complete our census and gather as many people as possible in our community to do the same. So as we are going to start this work of centering, recognizing, and discussing the importance of our individual stories and how they fill in the spaces and the narratives that we know and the ones that we don't know, I want to again remind us that we have the power. We've always had the power, and we've exercised that power to impact the lives of So as a consequence of that, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to our next presenter.
Dr. Adams.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to be invited and to share the stories of Moments of Resilience. I'm just going to share my screen here and give you a virtual tour of both the museum as well as the program. So hopefully, of course, it doesn't come up. Let's see what's happening. Okay, there we go. So as was mentioned, the Anacostia Community Museum, we were founded back in 1967. One of the interesting facts that a lot of people don't realize is that we've always been a Smithsonian museum. So we were actually founded out of the racial unrest that was happening not only in DC, but around the country in the 60s. And we were originally founded to actually be a place that would showcase the work of the museums on the mall, which is really interesting. So the idea was that they would bring things from the museums on the mall to the Anacostia Community Museum, and people would get so excited about them, they would go over to the mall. Well, the first director, John Kennard, said no, that would not work, and he was going to tell the stories of the African American community right there in Southeast DC. And so essentially the Anacostia Community Museum became the first African American museum within the Smithsonian system. And since that time has actually spawned community and ethnic-based museums around the country. The Smithsonian, so an overview, here's a quick kind of image of our original location, located down on Martin Luther King Avenue, and then our recent reopening of our new building. But like museums around the country, the Anacostia Community Museum, we collect, we preserve, we share the stories of the community. What makes us unique within the Smithsonian system is our emphasis on communities and neighborhoods, unlike our colleagues who are really more national museums. And this museum is even more important now based on what's going on in our community. I think when we started this conversation, it really was around COVID-19. And then just within the last few weeks, it really has become more about racial inequality, not only with COVID-19, but with other areas within our community. So our museum has always had that function of almost a social justice type of function within the museum. And our vision really is to create a more equitable future for all. And so the work we'll be doing pushes us towards that vision. So the program I'm going to specifically talk about today is called Moments of Resilience, and this launched back in mid-May. And it really was an opportunity, what both of our previous speakers talked about, in terms of capturing the stories of everyday people and how they're being resilient during this time of COVID-19. I think it's really important as we look back on this time period, whether it's 5, 10, 50 years from now, we're always going to have the data. We're going to know how many people were infected, how long it took to get a vaccine. We're going to have all of the numbers. But what we really want to make sure we do is we have those stories. One of the things I really liked about Dr. Moody's description was talking about Anna Cooper's archives. And if you think about it, people don't write letters anymore. They're not sending postcards. All of these types of things that really help share that story of what day-to-day life is like and what is happening right now. And so Moments of Resilience really encourages the community to share those stories. Now, because when this was launched, it originally started around COVID-19, obviously. So we are asking people to specifically share stories related to how they were being resilient during this time. I think that's really important, especially as we look at the African American community and we're looking at how we are able to persevere during times of trouble like these. And so it was really important for us to collect those stories. And so as we look, and then once we decided, or once the civil unrest started happening around the country, we knew we would be remiss if we would not add those components to our opportunity as well. So I just have a few samples from the website, and I do have the website at the end of the presentation so you can go and see all of the wonderful stories that are there. But I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about 3 of the stories that we received to give you an idea. The first one is called The Power of Prayer, and it is a march that took place from the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture to Black Lives Matter Plaza here in DC. And it was a march on a Sunday by Alfred Street Baptist Church. And so one of the participants in the march submitted her story talking about how she witnessed the collaboration between her church and the NAACP, a prayer walk for peace and justice in Washington, D.C. Hundreds of members, families, and friends gathered to promote and celebrate All Voices for Black Lives Matter, and then talking about where the march started and ended. And she talked about being honored to have witnessed and captured such a momentous moment in history. And that's really the point of this. I think people need to recognize we are living and witnessing history. And so how can we capture those everyday stories as history is being made? The next story is interesting. It's more of a personal story, and this was one that was sent in to us from a young bride, and this was part of the COVID-19. And one of the reasons why I really like this is because it really talks about just the everyday things that COVID-19 disrupted and how she was able to persevere against them. So essentially, she talks about buying her wedding dress in June of 2019. It was not her size and was fitted to what I hoped it would look like after she had tried it on. I was supposed to have a big wedding on June 20th in Asheville, North Carolina. I am now exchanging vows with my future husband with our parents as the audience instead of the 200 guests. We are excited for this intimate experience. So this is really a great example of how someone had one idea of what her wedding would be like and what it turned out to be. But I really loved how at the end she said that she was excited for this intimate experience and how she was able to persevere during this time period. And the final story I'll talk about is one about teachers. And this one is just so important coming from two educators. Both of my parents were teachers in the public school system. And so I think the teachers really are the unsung heroes, especially around COVID-19, because they were forced to really transition on a dime to go from teaching in the classroom on a Friday to virtually on a Monday. And so this is a teacher who writes in, and she really, the other reason I really like this is she really understands the importance of this history and why they need to capture it. So I'll just read her last line where she says, "We are living history, and this event is one for the history books. What a great time to be a history teacher in DC and in America." So I really love that enthusiasm and the idea of living through history and really capturing the moment. So one of the things I'd really like to make sure I encourage you to do is, so I've put on the website and then there's also a phone number. We are encouraging people, there are a variety of different ways you can share your stories, videos, pictures, or just calling into the chat line and telling us the story, but really talking about how you're being resilient during this time, whether it's related to COVID-19 or whether it's related to the current demonstrations that are happening to in our country right now. And I would also like to hopefully invite you all to the Anacostia Community Museum once we reopen and you have an opportunity to see our space. So again, thank you for inviting me to present, and I will turn it over to our next presenter.
Thank you so much. So we are going to now turn it over to Marcia Black, who is going to get us started with the workshop facilitation for today.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Sure can. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Yes, thank you so much for having me here today to present. I'm really excited to talk with you all about archiving. So the title of the presentation is Community Archiving in Unprecedented Times, which feels like a very fitting description for everything that we're experiencing right now in this moment. Like other folks have mentioned, like, yes, we originally thought that we were going to be dealing with this global pandemic, which on its own is quite an experience. But what we're seeing now is that we're also dealing with like global uprisings that we've never seen before, in addition to this pandemic. So yeah, I'm hoping to talk a little bit about the role of archiving in this moment and the necessity of it all. So I just put these two Washington Post covers. And the one on the left is a cover that is discussing the '68 uprising that happened in DC in response to MLK Jr.'s assassination. And the second one is a cover following the protests that occurred after George Floyd's death, or George Floyd's murder. And so I thought these two things were important to kind of uplift, knowing that there are a lot of folks here who are in the DC community, and then also just wanting to highlight that a lot of times that we look at these incidents as spontaneous, single things that occur, but a part of archiving is also having some reflection about the continuity that exists between these events, and the ways that our communities exist and have to respond to these things. And a part of us being able to do that type of reflection is, yes, through like looking at these things that are being documented via like mainstream sources of media, but also through like preserving our histories, and kind of taking agency and control over that process so that our voices are being uplifted as well. So the agenda I have set up is to do an intro and overview, which we're kind of in the midst of right now, to to discuss Black feminist archival praxis, which is something that which is what I use as my approach as an archivist, and I'll share a little bit more about that. To have a discussion about why archiving ourselves is an essential task, and the types of things, what should I preserve, what should I share? So some of these questions that come up when we're talking about people starting the process of thinking about how they might want to organize their archives. And I just want to affirm that everybody on this call, everybody listening, has something that's worth documenting, something that's worth sharing. So there should be like no question, especially if you're Black on this call, there should be no question that you have something of importance to share in this moment. So we could talk a little bit more about some of the things that you can do to start that. So I'll talk about archiving tips as well. So to start, a Black feminist archival praxis, it's one of the things that I've been thinking through while I've been in school. And it's a combination of me fusing together my organizing background with Black Youth Project 100, where we do work through a Black queer feminist lens, fusing that politic with a commitment to preserving Black history and kind of understanding that that is also resisting oppression, like that's a part of the work of resisting the systems that we're fighting against, and that it's a symptom of the world that we live in, that Black histories aren't actually invested in and aren't actually given the type of consideration that they deserve. It's a symptom of the system that Black histories have been erased, that for a lot of Black people who are descendants of enslaved Africans, that there's a legacy of us not having access to our history, and that's intentional. So we have to be just as intentional about making sure that we are preserving our histories now, and that we're able to have control and agency over that process. So I'm gonna read through these things, and then I am open to hearing feedback from the panel if there is any, and then we can move on to the next section. So these are kind of like principles that I use to describe what a Black feminist archival praxis would look like. So it regards race, class, gender, and sexuality as essential to holistically representing our histories, highlights personal relationships and community connections as, are you still able to see it full screen? Okay, perfect. Highlights personal relationships and community connections as imperative to the shaping of our legacies, prioritizes Black people's agency in the preservation process, utilizes fluid definitions of documents and records that center Black cultural methods of memory making, prioritizes community dialogue as fundamental to preservation, and unapologetically asserts that Black women are inherently valuable, aims to dismantle anti-Black, cis, heteropatriarchal values as normalized historically in preservation, and cultivate space for healing ourselves, for our ancestors, for our communities, both present and future. So oftentimes, like, people think of archiving and the thought is like documenting, preserving, sharing. But what I'm hoping to like push with this Black feminist archival practice is that archiving is a tool. It's an active process. It's a living process. So there really isn't an endpoint to archiving. And I think especially that there's an opportunity for us to be engaging archiving as we're thinking about these systems and ways that we might want to transform these systems, and that a lot of the answers that we seek for these things can be found through this process, can be explored through this process of archiving and reflecting on our histories.
Marcia, Lewis here.
Yes.
I know we're included, so can you point out where in here Black men who are down with Black feminism can find themselves in here? Because I know we're in here too. How can we be supportive?
Yeah, so I mean, feminism is, addressing the gender inequality that exists. And so men are also impacted by that, and not necessarily in a positive way, right? Like, we're having conversations about masculinity and ways that white supremacy and other ways make it not necessarily a healthy experience for men. So I think that even though men aren't explicitly mentioned in this, that there are definitely opportunities to be a part of this. I think pretty much everything on this list that Black men have an opportunity to adopt these things, be a part of this process. So in centering like Black women and Black queer and Black trans folks, it's not to exclude Black men, but it's rather to highlight those of us who are especially marginalized within this world. So everything in here, I encourage Black men to struggle with and think about how they can use these things.
Last question. I'm taking prerogative. As a host, is there a and maybe anyone on the panel can answer too, but is there a similar archival practice for Black men that you've seen or that you know exists? Curious.
So I don't know about one. I'm not sure if other people know about one. Yeah, I'd be interested to see what that looks like. I think there's a lot of opportunities. I think the point of being explicit about this practice being feminist is to make it so that gender is often not looked at as an issue. Like gender inequality issues aren't often considered as important as racial issues. But like what we're understanding in this moment and what Black Lives Matter and the movement is bringing our attention to is that there are violences and inequalities that exist and are perpetuated within our communities as well. And so regarding race, class, gender, and sexuality as being holistic and representing our histories is engaging with Black men to also consider how gender impacts their experience in this world. So feminism is an opportunity to be reflective about gender when it's often ignored. So like, yes, we need to talk about our Blackness, but also we do need to talk about the way we are impacted by gender.
Thank you.
So yeah, so Black men are gender too, and there's some reflection and work that could be done with that too. Okay, cool. So I'm gonna move on so I make sure I can hit all the points in my little short 30 minutes here. I'm excited to talk to y'all more. This is a quote that I love to reference, and it was a quote made by Barbara and Beverly Smith, who are two well-known, respected Black lesbian feminists who were part of the Combahee River Collective. And this is a quote about why documenting themselves is necessary. And so just to kind of like reiterate, while they're speaking directly to Black lesbians and feminists, that I still think that there's a lot of this that is relevant, even if you don't identify in these categories. Because truly what they're speaking to is the system that exists that makes it so that histories of those who are marginalized are not represented, are misrepresented, are intentionally erased. And so it's asking us to reflect about that and what our role can be in pushing back against that. So the quote is, "One thing we know as Black feminists is how important it is for us to recognize our own lives as history. Also as Black women, as lesbians and feminists, there is no guarantee that our lives will ever be looked at with the kind of respect given to certain people from other races, sexes, or classes. There is similarly no guarantee that we or our movement will survive long enough to become safely historical. We must document ourselves now." So yeah, I think that wherever you stand, I think that everyone on this call can in some way relate to not necessarily feeling valued, or like not seeing yourself, right? Like there's a reason why people on this call want to be a part of archiving their stories. And for a lot of folks, it's because when they have interacted with historical institutions or tried to engage with their history, that we identify that there's a gap, right? And there is a gap, and we have an opportunity to be active in making sure that that gap is filled.
Marcia, there's a question from, I think Iris McCullum has a question. Can we take that question now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Ms. Green, you have to unmute. There you go.
Okay. Good afternoon. I just wanted to point out that the gentleman asked about archival practice for men. I think some of the male's history is recorded in our archives through fraternities, fraternal organizations such as the Masons and the Elks, and all of course, our Divine Nine fraternal organizations. That might not be what they started out to do, but they have definitely documented their history. from their inception up to now. I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Iris. I appreciate that. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is why archiving in this moment especially is important. And so, yeah, like we talked about, right? Like COVID-19 plus global uprisings truly means unprecedented times. And so I'm definitely of the belief that even without these things happening, that it would still be of important priority for Black people to be preserving their history. So I think that this just adds an extra layer of urgency to this. But regardless of if this was happening, I still think that this is a fitting conversation for us to be having. So again, how I approach archiving is thinking about how archives can be engaged with, how archives can be an opportunity for us to build community with each other, for us to be reflective, for us to heal, for us to transform our communities. And so one of the things that Anacostia Museum, I think, is offering us with this Moments of Resilience archive that they've created is, this opportunity for us through sharing our stories. I think especially for folks who were alive, present, maybe active during previous uprisings that have happened, right? What do you have to offer in this moment? What is this bringing up for you? What experiences would you like to share? And I think having those conversations, I think especially with young people who are out in the streets right now and active and dealing with new things that we all haven't necessarily experienced before, that there are still conversations that we can be having, and archiving is an opportunity to do that.
Thank you.
Marcy,
I'm sorry, we have another question. Do you want me to wait till the end of the slide and then I can?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. So yeah, archiving also ensures that Black people's experiences and our histories are, and the history being created at this moment, are being documented and preserved. And so another distinction that I want to make is that things are being preserved, things are being documented, right? But they're not always being documented with sharing this information with Black people. So I do think that it is important. It is an important distinction to make about what documenting looks like when you're documenting maybe to spread an agenda, documenting to just inform the general public about things, right? The data that's being shared with us doesn't tell the complete story about what's happening in our communities. And so it's through archiving and documenting our experiences that we're able to provide fuller narratives about what we're experiencing, and that the things that are happening just go beyond the percentages of people who are losing their jobs, the percentages of people who are passing, the percentages of these things. And there are faces and stories and relationships that are behind these things. And in order to make sure that that is a part of the story that we tell 100 years from now, that it's important that we be active participants in that process. Yes, so what questions were there?
Ask your question.
Hi, this is Andy Dale Brown. I didn't have a question, but I did have a comment in relation to my story. I'm from South Carolina, and a couple years ago, my uncle, who was an attorney, had done our family history, and he asked us on his deathbed to begin researching and verifying and taking it as far as it could go. And I was very surprised that in South Carolina, when we called to try to research our history, where our documents were archived was burnt down. And so in South Carolina, especially particularly for African Americans, I can only get to my great grandparents, and then it's gone. So if we don't archive, it really makes tracking our history impossible. So I agree. It's from personal experience what you're doing, because now we're having to relate on stories, and we are meeting various people, and it's amazing how the various stories have really just, you know, we know how that goes. It kind of gets diluted through the years. And so our family now is sort of lost because beyond a particular spot. My uncle did trace our ancestry back to slavery, but now we have to figure out where we came from and how it all comes together. Whereas if we had taken a more active role, or our ancestors had taken a more active role, or if we had saved some of the documents and archived some of the documents, some of the pictures, some of the things that we had, we would have more now to help us trace our legacy. So I think during this time, you're absolutely right in that we all have to take a personal look at what we're archiving, what we're documenting, and making sure that we're journaling and telling our stories as well, because we don't know how impactful it could be in the coming years. Thank you.
Ms. Brown.
Thank you. Yes, that was powerful. I appreciate you sharing that with us. Louis, were you going to add something?
No, I agree. That's an excellent example.
I want to add something. Shirley Logan.
Hi, Shirley.
Hi. I just want to add that listening to my sister there talk about going back to South Carolina and discovering that a lot of the material had been destroyed. I'm from South Carolina, but I'm sure it happens in other places as well. But one of the things that I have really recognized that we all need to do, male or female, is to record. We should take advantage of the technology that we didn't have back in the day. So sit down with somebody who, particularly someone of an earlier generation, and have them talk to you about what they remember about their experiences that they may not have written down, but they will talk. They're happy to talk about it. And just use the old technology of tape recording, or if you want a video, we could do that as well. But that's also a way to capture some of the history of this moment, is to have people sit down with you and talk to you about it, and you can articulate what you're thinking and experiencing. And of course, later it can be transcribed and published or whatever, but at least capture it in some way that will catch it while those people are remembering what they experienced.
Thank you for that. Yes, I agree. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later on as well. So I know this is it's a short, just like exercise for us to think about in the future about, one item, right? Like, what is one item in 100 years when youth are learning about this moment? What is one item they will have as a representation of your legacy? So I'm going to ask for the panelists here, if you could think about an item, and if there's somebody who would like to share, maybe one or two people who would like to share. And then I'm also going to ask the audience members who maybe aren't able to participate to also think about this, and to stretch your imagination and think about things beyond like written documents, right? Like those are common archival materials that we think about. But I think there are other opportunities and other information that is important and can be shared to future generations that are attached to things that we don't usually think about as something that we want to preserve. So if there's anybody who'd like to share that item.
So this is Janice Farabee.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Well, my item is a mask with the AKA symbol on it with the vote, because this 2020 is a pivotal year. And for me, I'm an elected official. I will also be running again. I'm a speaker, a social entrepreneur. I'm a docent at the Museum of African American History and Culture, where we share the American history through the African American lens. And it's so important, we talk about how is this going to be interpreted, because we interpret the contents of the museum. And I think that it's so important for Black folks to own our stories and to tell our own stories so that we interpret our own stories, because other folks have interpreted them because they were telling them for such a long time, for over 400 years, and they've been misinterpreted. So for us now, so this is a mask that, for us is safety, is health, is life, but also the AKA, the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, a 3-generation, my great aunt, Dr. Dorothy Golding Farabee, a pioneering Black physician, female physician here in DC, plus the fact that the vote, again, 2020, the vote, so all those things to be interpreted for the next generation, for the girls that I work with, for the elected, for the people that I serve here in the community, the single member district that I work with. So I'm excited to be a part of this, and thank you so much for the work that you all are doing. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think that was a great example of how much value and history can be attached to what sometimes we look at as like these very simple, maybe you just walk past it every day, but like for someone 100 years from now, it could really speak to a lot. And yeah, I think that was a great example. Are there other people who would like to share?
Ms. Baker has her hand up. I'm going to unmute.
Thank you.
Oh, you might have to, Ms. Baker, I'm sorry, you might have to unmute yourself.
Okay, now, you hear me?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I thought about comparing, you talk about our experiences and what's going on today, and I thought a lot about, and I'm a pack rat, so I have stuff from the time that Martin Luther King riots took place, and I've been unhappy with where we are, and I think we all are, because we got the civil rights law, but there's so much that didn't happen after that. And I think that we need to be sure that the younger generation knows that you cannot step back and say, okay, we're moving along. We have to keep pushing. Otherwise, it doesn't happen. Because we had the riots, they did some things, but there's too much that didn't happen. And so we need to make sure that we tell that story in a way that our generations will continue to know. The stuff with the Green Book. I traveled with the Green Book with my children when we went to Texas. And that's something that this younger generation doesn't even imagine could possibly be the case. We had to plan our route based on where we could stay, because if you travel from here to Texas, it's a 3-day ride. So I'm just saying it's so important that we find a way to actually make sure that these things are written down and that they're shared and passed on. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Baker. And I think that that's a really good point. I think that's a good example of like maybe a conversation that should be happening, because I think, for instance, right, like when we're thinking about new models of resiliency in this moment, that transportation is being radically transformed for a lot of people. And also like we're experiencing like heightened racial tensions in a way that maybe other folks either weren't aware of, or I definitely think that it's changing. So like thinking about tactics like Black people sharing important like safety information via this Green Book, like how other models will become more important, I think, as like our infrastructure is continuing to change. Like people can't fly on planes like they used to because of the risk level. People are having to drive cross country, and like sundown towns still exist. I'm in Detroit, and so like people understand that there are places, for instance, in Upper Michigan that just aren't welcome for Black people. And so I think, yeah, like that could be a really great intergenerational conversation, oral history. And I think that's another really good example. Thank you for sharing that.
Marcia, this is Debbie. This is Debbie Liverpool, and I do have an example too. And it kind of goes with what you said and what Ms. Baker said. I have the sign that my father carried in the March on Washington. And it was so interesting to see my son out with the Black Lives Matter sign. And it's kind of neat to it's like, what did I miss in the middle? But it's good to see the transition through generations of sort of the same march, the same desire to have things happen that didn't quite get happen, during my time. So that's something I'm saving. I've got his sign. I know the African American History Museum collected quite a few of them, but he kept his sign, and I do have my dad's sign. That's kind of faded and wilted and rolled up, but I think that's something I'd like to frame as we see through the generations. Things haven't changed much, but things can continue to change.
Thank you for sharing that, Debbie. I am going to, these are all really good examples, and I hope that sparks some more thoughts for people if you're still thinking about, what are some items, what's one item that would be a good representation of my legacy, of something that I'd want to share for future generations.
Marcia, I wanted to talk, Marcia, before you keep going, there was another question that came up. Is Ancestry.com a way to archive? What is an organized way to archive?
Yes. So I will talk a little bit more about that in the next couple of slides. I think Ancestry.com is a great resource. I've actually just got reunited with some family via Ancestry.com who lived literally 15 minutes up the street, and we had no idea that they were there. So I think Ancestry.com is a really great way to do it. I think it's a really good opportunity to collaborate with other family members as well. And then I will talk a little bit more about other ways to be thinking about organizing your archives outside of Ancestry.com. So thinking about what should I preserve, what should I share, the short answer is anything that you deem as being valuable. So there's no strict benchmark here. I think especially, especially with creating your own personal archive, that this is your opportunity to take the reins, and one of the ways that you have agency in this process is by being able to be the person who decides what is valuable to you. Because oftentimes, like traditionally with submitting your things to archives, there is a person who is deciding, who is looking at your materials and deciding what is valuable to that institution. So you are that person. You are the person who gets to make that decision about what is valuable, what do I want to make sure is available for people in the future to have access to. And so I think good questions to have,
I'm sorry, can you share full screen? Yes. If you can share full screen. And while you're doing that, I just want to comment, we had a comment in the chat I'm trying to go back to, but I think it speaks to exactly what you're talking about, which is how do we not only how do we identify what is important, but also how do we identify ourselves as the archivist. I think that was a great comment from Daboiku, who said that, Ms. Baker could relabel herself from a pack rat to an archivist, right? And that those terms have historian, archivist, philosopher, that they've always been kind of racialized and gendered in a certain way, but, how do we reclaim those as the work that we're actually doing? So thank you.
Yes. So, I know that could be a fluid line of like pack rat versus archivist, and I encourage you to call yourself however you would like to call yourself. I do think that like a good rule of thumb to think about when you are collecting materials that feel a little bit questionable about whether or not they're valuable, or like whether or not it's important for you specifically to hold on to that. Like something I think about, for instance, are like newspaper articles and things like that. Like while they might be available in other places, it might be important for you to have that specific thing. And I think that that's okay for you to make that decision. And I'll talk a little bit more about like memento boxes and like what I kind of see as like an opportunity to do more like thematic archiving. If you don't necessarily want to think about at this moment about how you want to shape your whole personal archive. But yeah, I think that we're all archivists. I think we all have the potential to be archivists, to do archival work. And so that's my response to that. I'm not sure if I answered that for sure, but I know it is perspective about the pack rat versus the archivist, but maybe they're synonyms. I'm not sure. And I think that that's okay. So I have these reflections here, which I think are good questions to think about when you are trying to determine the value of an item. So who do you do it for, right? Like, who do you see as being the person who you would like to be looking at these things? And that doesn't necessarily mean that those will be the only people who are looking at your materials, but I think archiving is a relationship. So it's about what do you want to be preserved, and also what do you think is important for the people who could be using your archives, who could be looking at your materials, who could be reflecting and building a curriculum off of the things that you preserve. What do you have to offer? What do you want future generations to remember? And remembering that you are fully equipped to make these decisions, and you have agency in this process. So I wanted to talk a little bit about like types of materials and methods. So I think someone already mentioned the importance of self-documenting. So photography, social media, journaling. These are all really common ways that aren't necessarily always looked at as archival actions, but they have the potential to be. Like, you doing these things, you saving these things, you preserving these things, make it so that there can be this archive that exists with what you have to contribute to this moment, what you want to share about how you're experiencing this moment. Something I learned about was memento boxes, and so basically how I can describe it in short is thinking about like a time capsule, but not necessarily so much focused on like saving things that the memento box is focused on, you can kind of shape it around themes, for instance. So some things that I've been thinking about in this moment that might be interesting for people to think about is having a memento box that is dedicated to you saving things, documenting or saving items that represent how you've been able to create safety in this moment. I think what a lot of people are experiencing is a sense of lack of safety that as Black people we've had a general understanding or experience of, but that's been heightened. So like, what are ways that you've been able to recreate that? What have been your experiences in this moment of having community support? Like, do you have photographs? Do you have text messages or letters that you've been writing to people to make sure that you're investing in community, or you have community in this moment? Other things that I've been thinking about are like, if you have things that you would like to share about your experiences in the uprisings in 67 versus the uprisings in 22. If you have t-shirts, right? Like Miss Janice shared like the vote mask, right? Like that could be a part of a memento box. So I'm kind of looking at this memento box as an opportunity for you to kind of do a test drive archive. Like, it's a little bit more low stakes, right? Like, and it allows you to be more focused. And I think it would be a really good practice opportunity for folks who are interested in doing more work to organize and create their own archive. Oral history, which I feel like we've been talking about a lot throughout this call, and that the Anacostia Community Museum in this moment is really presenting a great platform and opportunity to kind of take off some of that labor, or to just share more widely the things that you would like to share. Considering that like this is available on the internet. So while of course we want to focus on creating local community opportunities for us to share history, but that there's also, because of the internet, an opportunity to spread your story more widely. So I think like taking advantage of that, and even if you are in the DC area, researching community archives in your area or museums in your area that are doing similar projects, which there are a lot of people right now who are really interested in making sure that people are able to document their experiences in this moment. So doing a little search about that, and also seeing if some of those institutions have support that they can offer you as you're starting to take on this task, this journey of archiving your things. Are there questions about that?
Yes, may I add something?
Yes.
I'm Antoinette St. Clair from Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. And one way that I have been contributing to my community is I have the Summer Neighborhood Activity Program every year. And usually other companies come into our community and we hire them to do jobs outdoors, like mowing the lawn and gardening and watering the lawn, or cleaning out the garage, things that they could do outdoors. Well, this year, instead of hiring companies outside of our community, my husband and I, we've been hiring the teams within our community, which is Northridge in Prince George's County, Maryland. And it's been very helpful for these teams because it keeps them off the street, puts money in their pockets, and they can pay for some of the things that they need or they have to do this summer, such as it was very difficult for the teams to find jobs this year because of COVID-19, because of social distancing, because of wearing the mask. But when you're outside, outdoors, you can still practice social distancing and wearing your face mask. So what I found out that we have teams in our neighborhood. They knock on the door and they know that we have this program and they ask, can we help you with mowing the lawn or something? And we say yes, and we pay them. We really do, and they enjoy. It's not if we pay them maybe $100, $150, and the same way we pay the companies that come into our community. Like one group came in and did my lawn, and they did flowers for me. They planted flowers, and we paid them $300. And the two of them split the money, and they were so happy to go out, and they had money to participate or to have for their own families. So this is one way of contributing to our community by giving back, not to the teens from 13 to 19, giving back to our teens because they are looking for work, and it's local, and it's not always having to go outside of our communities, but redirecting and recycling those dollars within our own communities.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing that. And I think taking it a step further about how can we support the youth and encouraging them to also start to document and share their perspectives about, for instance, how their whole summer experience has changed, right? Like youth are, because of social distancing, either you're stuck in the house or you're not able to actually engage in play and leisure in the same way that we've been able to do before. So how are they coping with these times and all that's happening in the world, right? Like as you're starting the archival process of archiving your things, I guess then how can you be supporting youth to be a part of that process as well? Or how can you share or collaborate on doing that type of work together? So thank you for sharing that, Ms. Antoinette. I know that I am running into time a little bit, so I do want to share. I do want to move on to the next slide just to make sure that I am able to share some of these more practical tips for people to use. Is it okay if I save your question after these two slides?
Sure.
Thank you. So thinking about digital materials first. So making an inventory of digital materials. So an inventory can be as simple as writing down the types of digital materials that you have. So if you have a lot of digital photos, for instance, maybe you want to be able to print some of those photos and preserve them in their physical form. If you have emails that you've been sending that you think maybe you want to add to a memento box that's talking about the ways that you've been still engaging in community building in these times. So thinking about these digital materials and not getting overwhelmed with everything that you have needs to be preserved, but really sticking to reflecting about what are the things that you deem of value, that you feel are valuable, and that you also think are important for future generations to have access to. And then just other things to think about, that you want to have multiple copies of digital items, because while digital things are treated as something that's permanent, right? Like it's in this cloud, it's in the internet, that these things aren't forever. And so there might be things that you might want to have physical copies of. There might be things that you want to make sure are stored in various locations. So if you have like a physical storage drive, or if you have like an online storage drive, or even just saving it on your computer, that if if there are things that are especially important to you, that it should be saved in multiple places, to make sure that you are able to indeed have access to it over time. There are also methods to archive social media if that's something that's important to you, and that's including like Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. So given the fact that like some people journal via Facebook, some people journal via Twitter, and so if you are one of those people, that there are ways for you to be engaged in that work as well. And I have some links at the bottom that y'all are not actually able to access or view or click in this moment, but I can share so that these links give you more information and more direct resources about how to do some of this work. So I can share that with the organizers of the event. Oh, yes.
Yeah, so just two quick things, and one of them has to actually do with what we were just talking about. My name is Trinita Brown, and I live in Washington, D.C., and yes, I'm also a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Incorporated. What I wanted to say is, one is, just in my own personal life, and just as advice to people, we say we have all these pictures, and it's wonderful, of relatives and different places and things like that, but if you don't get to someone, like for example, in my life it was my father, had books and books of pictures, but it was important that before he passed away, we got him on film, because that's faster, actually going through those pictures and saying what they were and who those people were. Because when that person passes away, you lose that connection. And you, of course, if you're lucky, have these things preserved, you have these lovely pictures, but unfortunately they're not as relevant because you don't have that tie. So just to remind people to go take a look at those pictures, get Grandma, Uncle Joe, whoever, to go through those pictures with you so that you have them. And also, if there are many services out there that help preserve pictures and digitize them, and that's also something to think about. And then the last thing was the connection to young people. My daughter's godfather is over 90 years old. He has amazing stories he always tells, and this is a connection to COVID summer. I always wanted to get those stories on tape, but then I thought, geez, she's home, she doesn't have a lot to do in the summer, all the camp plans and whatnot have been canceled. What a great idea for her to interview him and get those stories while she can. And it's so many of the things, she has no idea what he's talking about, but it's so wonderful to see her interested in learning about the past. And again, as I said, with COVID, there's so many opportunities for kids to do some things that they may have not done because they have the time. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Trinita. That was really important to uplift. Yeah, I think that, especially if we're thinking about young people and the opportunity, I think it's like older folks to be sharing your stories, is that oftentimes, like, as we're observing the things that are happening, like before we're getting some of the grounding of like our history, that folks see these things and think that this is the way the world is the way the world has been, that there are not other possibilities. And so talking to y'all about how the world has existed, how you've experienced it before, and like, yes, like the bad ways that it's existed, but also the ways that like our communities were more engaged with each other, or like other support systems that we had, for instance, before we were like really solely dependent on like looking to police for safety, right? Like a lot of folks are looking to other communal ways of engaging and protecting each other. And so I think that there are definitely lessons and connections that come with archiving and doing these oral history conversations with each other. And I agree about the context, right? Like, yes, you have these pictures, yes, you have these documents, or for example, with Miss Janice sharing her mass, right? Like without her providing that context, it would be really hard for us to understand like why that is significant. And it was through her explaining that significance that we were able to understand the value and like the larger thing of what her mass actually represented for her in that moment, how it embodies her legacy in this moment. So thank you again for Trinita for sharing that.
So should I jump in for Q&A now, or do you have one more?
This is the last slide, and it's honestly just reiterating, I think, what Trinita said. And I think the main thing I want to highlight is that, you want to also create an inventory of your physical materials. Well, let's focus on the fourth bullet point. So place items in boxes, organized in a structure that is most comprehensive and useful for you. Consider creating some written instructions explaining your organization. So I think in addition to creating some written instructions about what you're storing, why it's important, and how it's organized, that recording yourself talking about these things, recording yourself talking about items that you think are especially important that people hear from your mouth, why this is so important. And then just highlighting it's a really hot summer. Try to keep the items that are really important to you dry and cool, because mold, things just rot away, papers would just disintegrate. And so, like, even without having access to like the professional archival materials that are acid free and things like that, that even just taking steps to make sure that your materials are dry, are cool, and are not sitting directly in light, allows for your items to have a longer life. And that maybe eventually you'll be able to get access to materials or find other ways to preserve it. But in that moment, it's important to make sure that you're caring for your items so that they can have a long life. And that is my presentation. If you are on Instagram and you would like to stay connected, I welcome you to follow me on Instagram. And you can DM me. And if that is not a good option, then I can share my email. But Instagram is the best way to keep in contact with me. So thank you again for letting me present, and it's been a really great conversation so far.
Thank you so much, Marcia. And I just wanted to say really quickly that I'm going to turn it over to Denise to facilitate our Q&A, that we really are so grateful for you to come out and share your tips with us and share your experience with us. Marcia is on the front lines of these social protests. She's out there in Detroit holding it down. And so it just means a lot for you to take that time and to spend that time with us and to help create this kind of intergenerational conversation. And we will turn over to Denise. I think there's so many really great questions and really uncovering how many layers there are to this. And this is just our first workshop to get us thinking about this, but it's so exciting to see all the different ways that, questions that we're, so many of you and that we're thinking about all the complexities to this. So I'm going to turn it over to Denise, and she's going to get us addressing a couple of the questions that have come up.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Moody Turner. It's so perfect to have Marcia. Thank you again. That was an amazing, really rich, detailed, well-organized presentation. And there's a list of questions that have been coming from Facebook and from the group, and I'm going to organize them as well as I can so that we can be really focused. But it is an explicit line between your activist work literally on the ground, where you have been carrying the banner and doing the work to facilitate the kind of change that we want and need to see in our world, and the work that you're doing here with us, with our seniors in DC. So much respect and mad props. Okay, focusing. Has there been any discussion or curriculum or any pointed suggestions that you could make about healthy ways to engage family members about their history, about our history, especially when hard discussions might be emotionally triggering? Literally, what happens? How can we facilitate those conversations? How can we do so in ways that are caring and loving, particularly when they're difficult? That's the first one.
Hi, this is Melanie from Anacostia. I was going to jump in here. I think here it's really important to listen and wait for people to tell you their stories. And I say that because my mother's 89, grew up in rural Georgia. She will not talk about it. Like, if I ask her a question about it, she would change the subject, versus every once in a while she'll drop in these tidbits of things and you're like, what the hell? So you have to listen for when they want to tell the story and what they're dropping, because I think direct questions, who wants to relive the trauma? I mean, they're not going to have the discussion, so you have to really listen for when it does happen.
Yeah, and I just want to add a tidbit about acknowledging the difficulty and the bravery that comes with being vulnerable and having to relive some of these things to share. Because even though you don't want to ask direct questions, sometimes you're curious, right? You want to get a read. Do you remember this? Do you want to share about this? And it's through that read, you're kind of able to assess is this something that they want to share? So I think just acknowledging the difficulty of it, the appreciation of them sharing those things can be really affirming for folks who sometimes don't even think that those things are worth sharing. or that their particular experience like isn't worth sharing, like affirming that it's important to you.
Absolutely. So this is again for Marcia and for Dr. Adams. What about self-care and also a kind of caring ethic of what to do after the person has shared a story? Like, is there a process or a system or a way by which we can make sure, particularly when stories are traumatic or things that we can be attendant to be affirming and validating and careful as a consequence of asking our family members, friends, and or relatives to talk about these things that are so critical to their identity, but are traumatic and potentially
Well, I think, one of the things we can really do is know that it's not just a one and done conversation. Because even when I think about our curators that go out and collecting, you're developing a relationship with someone. Now, granted, if it's a family member, you already have that relationship, but you're not going to sit them down for 2 hours and drill them. It's going to be really kind of, again, knowing what types of stories you're trying to get from them, but also just as, again, acknowledging that this is hard for people and they may not want to talk about it all in one sitting. And so how are you creating a space? And maybe they want to write it. Maybe they want to draw it. Like, what are the different ways they could share that story? It's not only them telling you the story that's really important, but there might be other ways. And I really loved what someone said about the photographs. That's kind of the best ways. You just start showing them photographs and they'll start talking about the people in the photographs and telling you stories about them without even kind of having that interviewee type of relationship, but just storytelling.
Yes, I agree with Dr. Adams, and I think what this question speaks to is not wanting to replicate some of what we see where it feels very extractive. And like, I got something from you and now I'm gone and you'll never hear from me and you'll never actually see how I use your things. And so I think like at the core of like making sure that we don't replicate that is building relationships with people, is engaging with these things as an opportunity for you to build new relationships with people, for you to strengthen and deepen your relationships to people. And I think if you're able to understand it as you working to do that you won't be extractive, right? Like, because it requires that you do be in communication with folks, that you do follow up, especially when you are asking people to share traumatic things. Like, I definitely think like an aftercare approach of checking back in with that person, taking them to lunch, bringing them something. Because it is like how we understand that things can be physically toiling, like sharing your stories can be emotionally toiling for people, spiritually toiling. So like acknowledging that and responding to that as well.
Absolutely. This question follows up on that one, actually. How do we address issues of fear that an individual may have about losing control of their own narrative, losing control of their own story? If they share their story with you, and then you then share their story at the family reunion, and then it becomes a collective story that may have been a private story, what are some of the ways that we can be attendant to information, privacy, and control?
Well, I think, we always call it the cone of silence. Like, don't tell people, if they're not your stories to tell. That's the way I always like to think about it. So if they want to share that story, that's great. But it is, as if they're sharing that story with you, they have to be confident that it's not going to go any further than you. It isn't something that you should write up in a paper or use in any other way without their permission. And it's almost, no different than a museum and you're collecting people's artifacts. You let them know how you're going to use them, what you're going to do with them. They sign something. So I think it really is, privacy is really important if people, family members or otherwise, are going to be expected to share their story. And I think as you look at moments of resilience, anything you see on our website, they signed a release saying it was okay for us to share those stories. We have many more stories than the ones that are on the website, but you can't share things that people don't allow you to share.
Louis here. The same is true at AARP, where we collect thousands and thousands of stories from our 83 million members throughout the year to year. And you get clearances for every newspaper article, every photograph, every audio recording. You get permissions. And inside a family, you want to get those same kind of permissions.
Absolutely. That is awesome. Okay. Some of these questions have already been responded to. And there's one in particular that I think we're going to be dealing with explicitly next week. So I'm not going to raise that one. I will move with Dr. Moody Turner's validation into the homework piece, because I think it's homework that we have next, or is there someone else who's coming next?
We have one question from the audience.
Okay.
I'm gonna open it up for that question, and then we'll move into the homework piece and wrap, so we can be respectful of everybody's time and get you to come back next week. Okay, so is this Michael St. Andreas? Are you there? Can we hear? I don't think we can hear you. Would you put your question in the chat, perhaps?
Is this line muted?
I'm trying to unmute it, but our radio talk show capabilities are fledgling. So we'll look for that question in the chat, and if we can't address that today, we will come back to it next week.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I did put something in the chat.
There you are, okay.
Okay, so can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, it really wasn't a question. It was a comment. As I was listening to this, I thought of the perspective that from several different aspects of my life. The first one was growing up as a Black boy in the segregated South. The second one was as an openly gay man. And thirdly, was as a person living with HIV and AIDS. And juxtaposing that against my experiences of witnessing firsthand, Martin Luther King was murdered my senior year in high school in 1968. And I was given the task of writing a play for the senior class that sort of gave a reflection on that experience. And the play that I wrote was rejected by the principal because he thought it was too political and too thought it might create some problems. And my mother and the pastor of my church went to the Board of Education and got the permission for the play to be produced. And it was done, and it was met with a great deal of respect and commemoration. And all of my life, that has been, I felt like not able to be fully myself sometimes as a gay man and being Black and being disrespected in my church community or not acknowledged as a full human being. Then with the stigma of living with HIV, that gave me another way to try to live within my community and feel that I wanted to be a part. And then the experiences of growing up in the segregated South. And fortunately, I'm now 70 years old. And I can tell you that in those years, I have managed to find a way to live a full life, a life that I feel has been contributive and helpful. I've been a teacher. I've had small businesses in our community, and I stay connected. In fact, I'm very active in AARP, as Lewis can probably tell you. And I've just found a balance that I think is a story that needs to be preserved. I did submit a story, and I don't know if it's been received yet, but I think I just put it in yesterday. So that's kind of how I want to find a way to participate in this with those aspects of my experience. I don't know if that matters.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming in and for sharing that story. And I think that really goes back to Marcia's presentation and thinking about all of the range of voices and diversity of stories that are so important to this larger project, not just the Anacostia project, but a larger project of Black history. So I will turn it back over to Denise, who is going to cue us up for our homework for next week.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Moody Turner. And Michael, that's exactly the kind of thing that we're talking about, because you actually set me up perfectly. What we are asking all of our present participants to do is to identify at least one item, one thing, one area. It could be a picture. It could be a particular piece of memorabilia. It could be identifying who the griot is in your family. Who's the story? Are you the storyteller? Is it your dad? Is it your godmother? Is it your uncle, your great uncle? Identify one person, one thing, one item that you would like to start the process of actually conscientiously collecting. So Michael is talking about the fact that he submitted his story, which is perfect. Do you have your own story? Do you want to speak to someone else? Do you want to record them? Do you want to interview them? Do you want to sit down and go through your pictures with your dad or with your mom or with your aunt or your uncle and start to identify who the people are? Identify the one thing that you want to work on specifically for the next workshop, because you know we actually have this in 2 steps. So the next workshop that we have, which will be almost the same time in the same station, but we'll send out a new link, so you'll get a new link. We are going to actually talk about the practicalities of preservation. So that's why one of the questions in the chat I did not actually respond to, because that's going to get built into the next workshop, which is literally what do we do with funeral programs and obituaries? And that's a literal practical, what's called a material object. And we're going to be covering that in our next workshop. So if you have a collection of funeral programs and you decide that you want to work there, or you have a collection of obituaries, whatever practical pieces, see Marcia nodding enthusiastically, yeah, girl, we are working this. So whatever your practical, wherever you want to start your curated collection, whatever that item is, get it queued up and ready, because we are going to be working with that item or those items next week, same time, same station, at part 2 of our workshop presentation. So get ready, tell any and everyone that you want to come ahead and get there. If they don't have their item, they are free and welcome to join us. All of this is going to be available online. You'll be able to watch the recorded presentations and you'll be able to participate. So if you weren't able to participate in part 1, come anyway to part 2 and we're going to catch you caught up. But for those of you who are here and you can tell your friends and anyone else who might be interested in participating, identify an object or a thing or an idea that you have around which you want to start building your collection, your expressions of yourself, of your family, of your community that will capture not only who you are in this moment, but who you were and who you want and how you want to be remembered.
Okay, so with that, we are going to wrap up our session for today. If you have questions, please add them to the chat. We're going to go through them and try to pull some more content out for next week so that we can get to those questions. And I just want to close again with a thank you to everybody for joining us today. A thank you to the women from AKA for joining us and bringing all of the knowledge and wisdom and experience that you have to our conversation. And I want to thank some of the people who haven't been mentioned, again, Lewis Davis, but also Emily Pickburn from AARP for co-organizing, my co-director, Gabrielle Foreman, with the Center for Black Digital Research, of course, Denise, thank you, Kevin Winstead for handling our tech. Wait, Kevin doesn't like to be seen, but he's there. He's always there. Kevin Conaway with the Office for Digital Pedagogy and Scholarship, as well as Jennifer Asazi, Mark Kepler, Emily Spotkiss, also Clay Coleman with the Color Conventions Project, Adrian Corbin, Justin Smith, Sabrina Evans, Brandy Locke, Lauren Cooper, Jim Casey, Ms. Jonassy Lancaster, and Melanie Adams from Anacostia Community Museum. A special thank you to Marcia Black for facilitating our workshop today. And I just, you get to see how many people, it really is for us about community and collective and the joint efforts of so many people to make this work possible. So thank you all so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you same time, same place next week. And Mr. Davis, if you have any comments you'd like to close out for us?
Yeah, I would. I'd like to thank all. As you read that list, it sounded like we just made a major motion picture. You know, the way those credits roll. But thank you for you called out Emily Pickard and my team, and she's been the steward for me on this project. I want to remind everybody where I started. I want to end with, and that's the as you build your archive, if those archives include stories that are real prescient right now for you. That's really my gist for this. Blacks, brown, and yellow people, black, brown, and yellow people have been dying disproportionately because of every type of disenfranchisement and every way that we're disproportionately represented in the wrong categories of sickness, unemployment, and economic and other social strifes. And so those stories are very important. And I want us to remember the bus driver, the school teacher, the first responder, EMS worker, the nurse in a hospital, the orderly in a hospital, all of whom have been on the front lines and are not always seen. And they're not the heroes. They don't dunk basketballs. They don't make millions of dollars. But they have been the ones having to go to work to keep the rest of us safe and the rest of this world even, but especially here in D.C., going and around the country. And their stories are so important. My barber lost his mother, who was only 50. And she was put to rest last week by her mother, who contracted COVID-19, but somehow survived. But her mother now walks with an oxygen tank. So these stories are real, and they have to be captured and told. And they're stories of survival as well, and thriving even during these times that we don't want to miss out on. I want to thank you all so much for participating and for the team that I've had a chance to work with here today and next week. And we'll be back probably several more times throughout the year. We're not done with this yet. Thank you all. So I can pull the plug.
You're welcome to stay. We can keep talking. Thank you.
Hey everybody, across the world today, something is moving. Please don't get in the way. It's lifting spirits. The poor can feel its power. It's getting closer.